Hey everyone, it's Aleem here. If you were handed a strange object and asked to identify it, you'd probably look at it from several different angles in an attempt to figure it out. Working with a pivot table is similar to investigating a strange object. In this case, the object happens to be your data. A pivot table invites experimentation, so feel free to rotate and manipulate the pivot table until you're satisfied. You might be surprised at what you discover. Now, first of all, for those of you who've never used a pivot table before, this is about to change your life in Excel. A pivot table is a really powerful tool that allows you to break data down by categories. Now, sometimes pivot tables can be used to display counts of data. They can work with numerical data or even categorical data. And again, my goal today is to show you how to use pivot tables. I'll give you a good introduction to them. And then the best way really for you to learn this is to play with them. The first example I want you to open up and actually look at is called ElectMart Sales. And the objective here is to use pivot tables to break down the customer order data by a number of different categorical variables. And a categorical variable is just a variable that gives a name to something. Like in this case, we've got categories of credit card type, gender, region, time of day when the purchase was made, and so on. Now the solution is a data set that does consist of 400 customer orders. It is fictitious data and it comes from the Winston and Albright book. Again, that's provided to you on Canvas. The first pivot table I want you to make should look like this. So what you're going to do is open up your data set, go to Insert, and then click on Pivot Table. And I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so here's your data set opened up. At the top over here, this will tell you all of the different categories and what they mean. So anytime you see that little red triangle, it will explain what the category is. So here it's the day, this is the time of day when the sale was made or when the order was made, the region in which it was made, the credit card type that the customer used, the gender, and in this case they've only got binary gender, male and female. They've got the category of purchase, so low, medium, or high, and that's whether or not they've bought a lot in the past from this company or a little bit in the past from this company, the number of items that were purchased on the order, the total cost of the order, and then the cost of the highest or most expensive item in the order. Now to insert a pivot table, you don't actually have to select the entire thing. So long as the data is contiguous, it will automatically select everything together. Just be careful if you do have a break in your data, let's say, 4,000 rows down, you happened to have a break, it will only select up to that break. Don't ask me how I know that. We'll put that one in the lessons learned the hard way category. So click on Insert. Now from the Insert menu, you're going to see Pivot Table. Click on it. It will automatically, again, select the range. And usually I just do a quick double check here to make sure that that's going to the bottom of my range. And there are 400 data points, and this is going down to row 401. So to me, that makes sense. I will choose New Worksheet and then just say OK. If you've got multiple tables and you want to actually work with multiple tables, you can add that to the data model as well. Now what this gives you is the UI for a pivot table, and this is what it's going to look like over here. It's an empty space, and then on this side you've got all of your different categories. And the first thing we wanted to do is to make that pivot table as we saw in the PowerPoint. So you can pull that back up on the screen if you wanted to. On the left we had time of day, afternoon, evening, and morning. And I just checked the box and that shows up automatically. And then underneath that I wanted to put region. Okay, so we've got afternoon, evening, and morning. We've got the region underneath. And then I wanted my total costs. Now think back to when you were dealing with sum if and count if, or sum ifs and count ifs. You would do a sum ifs for each of these different regions, and you could do this pretty easily with a formula. But look how quick this is. I can even just check the box, and it will add the sum automatically here. Now I want you to notice that this pivot table doesn't quite look like the one in the PowerPoint, and that's why you can click on Design. And from the Design menu, you can choose what you want it to look like. If I click on Subtotals over here, I can show the subtotals at the bottom as opposed to the top of the group. So here I'll click on Bottom, and that moves the total, instead of being up here, it moves it down to here. In the report layout, right now it's in compact form like this. I could show it in what's called tabular form, where it will actually expanded out, and that's what I've got in the slide deck. Okay, now a couple of things you can do with this, just to show you. If, let's say, I didn't want to know much about my evening sales, I was really mostly concerned with my day-to-day transactions, I could hide my sales in both the morning and I could show my sales for the morning and the afternoon. I could hide the evening transactions. And similarly, you're going to notice here that region only has Midwest, South, and West. Now, the way you do that is as follows. So go into here. If I click on afternoon, you'll see this little arrow at the top, and I can click on it. I can uncheck evening and then say OK. I'll show you that one more time with the region. Which region did I want? I wanted the Midwest, the South, and the West. So I don't want Northeast. Here I'll click the little arrow and uncheck Northeast and say OK. So what's nice about doing it this way is you've now got your data filtered. I will caution you though, make sure you look up here to see that your data is filtered. It will also put a little funnel on this side over here so you can see those funnels. Be careful of this, because if you're trying to answer a question on an exam, or if you're doing this for real and you forget to unfilter your data, then the answers you're going to get will be incorrect, and that can get very frustrating if you don't understand why you keep getting the wrong answer. Sorting values or categories. So it is easy to sort in a pivot table either by the numbers in the values area or by the labels in the row or columns field, and let me show you what that looks like as well. So for example, let's say I wanted this to be in ascending order, so to go from smallest to largest. We see 3835 is actually smaller than 3878. So if I want to sort this in order of smallest to largest, I can click on any of the numbers that I want to use for the sort, and just click on data, and just sort like you normally would. So here A to Z will go from smallest to largest, and it will move this stuff around automatically. Notice it only did this for the morning, and now this is in an inconsistent order. So you would want then to reorganize this as well if semantically you wanted it to go south and then Midwest and then west. To do that, you're going to click over here, and you can either right click on it and say move up, right, move south up, and it will do that. Or you can put your mouse on the side until you get the move icon. Can you see how it changes into an icon that's got the arrows and going in both directions there? When you have that icon, it means you can click and drag and move stuff around. And I could click Midwest and drag that down, or I could drag that back up, so it's higher up. So that's all you're really doing there, is you're moving stuff around. So again, just to recap, you can sort within an area. Let's say I wanted morning before afternoon. I could even click over here, put my mouse over the edge, and you'll see again I get that move icon. And now I can click and drag this above afternoon. And to me that looks a lot better. I've now got morning before afternoon the way I want it. If you want to sort in numerical order, I clicked on the numbers, I went to data, and I chose sort. And again, you can do this any way you want to, if it makes sense. Pivoting. So you can choose where to place variables in a pivot table. So for example, let's say you wanted the region variable along the top, and then along the side, you wanted the time of day. The way you can do that, and let's get rid of our filters here. So I'll click over here and put Northeast back on. I'll click over here and I'll put evening back on. So now what we've got is our time of day. We've got our regions back where they are. But now we're going to pivot our data, and what I mean by that is I'll click region and drag it under columns. And when you do that, you now get two-dimensional data. So now, rather than being nested under rows, what you've done is you've reproduced the data now in two directions. So you've got your time of day down the left, and then your region along the top. And again, I think that's a very quick and easy thing to do. Now let's look at changing some of the field settings. You'll notice right now we're showing the sum, but what if you wanted to show the average instead? And also, what if you wanted to format it so that the numbers were in dollars? Well, the way you can do this is you can click on this, and down on the bottom right over here, there's a little arrow under values. So where it says sum of total cost, I'll click the little arrow, click on value field settings, And then it says show values as, and I can choose average. For example, you can choose count, you can choose max, you can choose min. There's all kinds of things in here. Standard deviation, variance, count. Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff in here. Choose average in this case. And in fact, let's set our number format. So we'll click on number format and put it in a counting format with 2 decimal places, and then say OK and say OK. And you'll see that now it changes the dollars into dollars. It changes what we were looking at before from a sum to an average. So this just looks a lot nicer too. Pivot charts. Now for those of you on a Mac, you don't have pivot charts yet. For those of you on a PC, this has been there for quite some time. And I don't say that with any smugness in my voice. Mac is definitely getting better over time. For example, they've just recently added flash fill. But I find that the analysis that you really want to do with data, Mac continues to lag far behind PC for that. So just if this is something you want to do for real, I would strongly encourage you to get familiar with the PC environment, both in Excel and in Access you're going to need to be on a PC anyway. So pivot charts. It is easy to accompany a pivot table with a pivot chart. We talked a little bit about dashboards in the lecture content last class, but just to show you what this looks like, if you click on Design, actually it's under Pivot Table Analyze. If you click that and you choose Pivot Chart, here's what's really cool. If you say OK, this chart is in real time. And what I mean by that is if I reorganize my data, let's say I put region back down over here, the chart changes. If I put time up here, the chart changes. If I put time down here and region up here, the chart changes. Again, this is absolutely incredible, the fact that you can change things so quickly. And when we talk about slicers in just a second as well, there's a lot of other stuff you can do to make this very, very, very usable for your end user. What I find is very fun is you hide or you protect the data tab, and then you just give the user access to the front end and you give them some slicers that they can click on. And now you're representing the data to them very quickly. You're allowing them to make changes very quickly. Like even here, we've got some UI elements. I can click on region here and it brings up a filter menu, right? So I can get rid of West as the end user and it will hide West right out of my data. I can click back over here and put West back in. And again, it puts West right back in the data. So what's really nice about this is they're really starting to build in a lot of that functionality already. Notice we had sorted by region, and it remembers that we had sorted, and you can see that over here under region, that we have a sort in place, right? They're sorted A to Z. Okay, so that's pivot charts. You can also include multiple variables in the values area. So maybe if you're showing an average, you might also want to show a sum, or more often than not, if you're showing an average, let me get rid of this pivot chart. More often than not, when you're showing an average, you would typically want to show the number of things that make up that average, maybe as an estimate of how reliable that average is. Like an average of 2 things really doesn't give you much power, whereas an average of maybe 100 things is a much better representation of an average cost. So I'll choose total cost and again drag it back to where it was before. And you can put both of these things here. Your pivot table will just expand. Now instead of sum of total cost, I'm going to go to value field settings. Now I'll choose count. And what that will do is it will count each instance of, or it'll count each sale. I can choose number format here, and because the count is just a general number, I want it to show up as a number, and then I'll say OK, and I'll say OK. And you'll notice now my counts are in number format, whereas my prices and my average costs here are in dollar format. And you can have those things differ, right? Which is really quite nice. I will also quickly mention here that when you do this, you still can modify what this stuff looks like the same way you normally would. Like you can hit Control-Shift $ here, and now it'll put that in dollar format. Okay. In case you didn't know, by the way, Control-Shift $ puts things in dollar format. Control-Shift 5, like a percent sign, puts things in percent format. Control-Shift 1 puts it in numerical format. Again, this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but if you really want to be good at Excel, learn your keyboard shortcuts. It will make you a lot faster when you're working with the app. Okay. Summarizing by count, we just did. Now this is useful when you want to know how many as opposed to how much. This is like the difference between count if or sum if. And again, we just talked about what counts look like. When you count, by the way, it doesn't really matter what you count. You can count dollar amounts, you can count even the time of day. Each observation will still just count as one, and your count will always total to the total number of observations, which in this case was 400. So it's always a good idea to double check and just make sure that things are copacetic with what you expect. Grouping data, and this is a really, really cool feature in pivot tables. When you group data, it will remember those groupings, and you're going to need to know that for when you're dealing with the tutorial this week. When you group data, it will group and remember those groupings. So if I come back to my pivot table, let me get rid of my average here. So now I've got a pivot table that looks like this. In fact, let me get rid of the time of day as well. And under total cost, let's change this to sum. And I'll make my number format dollars. So we'll put this back in accounting format. So what I've got right now is just my total cost, right? My total cost for all of those orders. And now let's put the day. So if I drag day under rows, actually not day, let's put date. Put the date under rows. In the newer versions of Excel, what this will automatically do is it will subtotal all of the months automatically. But let's say you didn't want to do that, I can come back over here and just drag months out. Now what I've got is from March 6th all the way to the end of my data set automatically listed here. It's got the region over here. And in fact, you could get rid of the region if you didn't want it. And now you've just got the date and the total cost. Now let's say you wanted to put your own grouping in here. You right click, you go to group. So again, I right clicked over here. I went to group. And you can choose how you want it to be grouped. Let's say you're doing month end. You could just choose only months here. And you could pick your start date, you could pick your end date. Let's say you wanted to have a month that started at the beginning of the month. So instead of March the 6th, we could say March the 1st. And we could end at our last date, but now that I've changed it this way and say OK, you can see it has now grouped my sales by month. I've got $9,383 in the month of March. What you can also do is you can group by sales dollar amount. So let me just show you what we're trying to work toward here. Let's say I wanted to create this pivot table over here. On the left, you can see I've got row labels from 0 all the way up to $500. And then my count of total cost indicates the number of observations at each of those different costs. So what I'm going to do is let me come back to my data set. I'll take date out of there. I've got my sum of total cost over here, which I'd like to change from a sum to a count. I should have changed my format. Now let's say I didn't want to change it over there and I just wanted to do that here. Do you remember what it was to change it to a number? Control Shift 1, and that changes it into number format. Okay, so what we have over here are 400 observations. Now what I'm going to do is I'm taking total cost and I'm going to drag it into rows. Now what this does is it's telling me I've got one observation at $6.82. Again, one observation at $14.76, and so on. And what I'm going to do here is right click and go to group. And now I'm going to group from 0 up to the highest dollar amount. And let's just do this by 50 because that kind of gives me a number of categories that seems okay. Say OK here, and now you can see I've got 0 to 50, 50 to 100, all the way up to 500, and the number of observations in each of those ranges. And now if I insert, I did it again, pivot table analyze. Now if I insert a pivot chart, what I've effectively created here is a histogram. And it took us no time at all. In the design area, I showed you this already, you can show or hide subtotals. You can also deal with how you want to treat blank rows under the pivot table options. The third point there, displaying the data behind a given number. I find that many students, when they're looking at this, will struggle. They'll say, well, hold on, 50 is here and 50 is here. Which one actually includes the count of exactly 50? Well, you can double click on any of these numbers here. And what's really cool is if you do that, it will open up another data set. It will make a duplicate of your data, and you can see that this is now on sheet 2. Now what's cool about this is it's actually copied over the data to this worksheet. This is not your original data. So you can do what you want with this to verify if the numbers make sense, and you could start counting things with this. You could delete things in here, and you're not going to affect your initial data set. Okay, so that's a really nice thing to look at. One of the questions I asked is, well, hold on. Is the 50 here or is the 50 here? And I'll let you play with that to take a look and see where the 50 actually lies. Okay, so you can double click, you can go in, and then just try to validate or verify this for yourself using COUNTIF just to see, where that number lies. What you might need to do is change an actual observation, put this in dollars as opposed to count, and then put an actual observation in there that is exactly $50 just to see what happens. Formatting a pivot table we've already talked about. In the design ribbon you can play with the colors as well. I will just caution you, just like with pivot charts, don't get overly fancy with colors and formatting. Sometimes less is more, and I can quite honestly say I've had students try to play with the really ugly and really creative charts that also come with pivot charts. Those do have a time and a place, but for what most of we're going to be handling in this course, it is neither the time nor the place. Moving or renaming pivot tables. In the pivot table action groups, you can actually rename stuff. You can also rename what your data is called in a pivot table. So instead of just instead of total cost here, let's say I wanted to call, let's put region up here. Let's say instead of Northeast, I wanted to call this Surrey. Well, I could type the word Surrey here and it will automatically replace that in my pivot table. So now whenever it sees Northeast, it replaces that with the word Surrey. Again, you can do this with, let's say you've got a category that's numerical, where let's say 1 was strongly disagree, 2 was disagree, 3 was agree, and then 4 was strongly agree. Well, let's say your numbers were coding those words as opposed to actually having those words in your data set. This is where you would then use the naming to make your pivot table look the way you want it to look. And then finally, one last thing I wanted to show you here are what are called slicers. And the way you access slicers, again, is under Pivot Table Analyze, and click on Insert Slicer. And what a slicer will do is it will allow your user to filter the data using a front-end interface. So for example, I could choose region and say OK, and now what it does is it puts this thing up on the screen, and now your user has a click interface where they can automatically just choose which region they want, and this will update automatically. Again, fancy, right? It's not really hard to do, but it looks really nice, it looks really fancy, and it allows you to work with your data very, very quickly. I'll also quickly mention here you can insert multiple slicers for the same set of data. So this is working with data that has cardinality, where the numbers actually mean something. It gets a little bit more complicated when you're dealing with data that doesn't have numerical value, or if you're dealing with categorical data. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. What I want you to do is open up Lasagna Triers. And here our objective is to use pivot tables to explore demographic variables to distinguish some of our lasagna triers from our non-lasagna triers. So this is a company that fictitiously is selling that frozen TV dinner for one. Okay, so they've got 800 potential customers, and they've got some data about those potential customers, and they've got their ages, their weights, their income, how much they make, the value of their car, how much credit card debt they have, whether they're male or female, whether they live alone, the type of dwelling they're in, the number of trips they make to the mall, which neighborhood they're in, and then for us, most importantly, have they tried our lasagna? Okay, so go ahead and open up. This is going to give me an error. Close this. Okay. Go ahead and open up. Where is this? You want Lasagna Triers. By the way, when you download files off the web, don't forget to click on Enable Editing so it allows you to make changes to this as well. If you click on Source, you can see this is fictitious data. And let's see what the author's preconceptions were about who eats these frozen TV lasagna dinners. So what we're going to try to first do here is to make this first pivot table. So we're going to put gender down the side, male and female. We're going to put whether or not they've tried our lasagna, and we're going to express this as a percentage. Now I want you to notice here that this is 100% and this is 100%. So what we're saying here is that out of all of the males who have tried my lasagna, 39% of males have tried it, 61% of males have not tried it. Okay? For females, we're saying 45.73% of females have not tried my lasagna, and 54.27% of females have tried my lasagna. That's a very different question from what percentage of people who have not tried my lasagna are male. Now, if that were the case, then these bottom numbers here would be 100%. These would not. Again, I'll show you this as we get a little further along here. Now, the first thing we need to do is to make our pivot table. We need to put gender on it in rows, and we need to put whether or not they've tried our lasagna in columns. Click on Insert, go to Pivot Table, and then say OK. So we wanted gender in our rows. We wanted to put whether or not they've tried our lasagna, so we'll click on Have Tried and drag it to columns. Now, it really doesn't matter what you put down over here under values because this is just a count. Just be careful, if you put anything numeric, it will default to some. But what's nice is if you put anything down here that is non-numeric, like for example, whether they live alone, it will automatically set it to a count as opposed to a sum. Okay, so it will count those data for you. We were expressing this as a percentage of row, so we wanted this to be 182 out of 398, and then 179 out of 458, and so on. To do that, we'll click over here and go to Value Field Settings. Now, this is probably something many of you haven't played with before. There's a second tab over here called Show Values As. When you click it, you can choose how you want to do the calculation, which in this case, we want percentage of row total. Now, I will show you, because there are a couple of questions that may require you to use some of the other stuff in here. I'll just point out a couple of these. You've got things like percent difference from, and so on. Okay, so here we want to have the calculation as percentage of row total. It's because we want the row total to be our denominator, and we want to express everything in here as a percentage of these numbers at the end of the row. Say OK, and we can see that we get the same numbers, or roughly the same numbers that we have in the slide deck. We've already talked about slicers. I'll just quickly mention as well, there is something called a timeline, where it allows you to filter within the dates and to choose date ranges as well. So just keep that in mind. Other reminders, don't forget to turn off filters when using them. If you are aggregating and showing things as a percentage, if you're using count versus sum versus average, but you're showing things as a percentage, those percentages are going to change. So don't forget to change from count to sum or to average if you are going to be playing with those different ways of aggregating your data. You can also tell if your data is filtered if that funnel appears next to any of your fields. So just watch out for that as well. Thanks for watching.